there's still a distinction between Jew and Gentile, between circumcised and uncircumcised. And you actually argue that when Paul's referring to the circumcised in some of these passages, he's actually referring to the Gentiles that have now come into the covenant by faith. Romans 4, 1 through 12 is one of them. Can you talk a little bit about first Romans 4, verse 1, and how you translate it and how it's been traditionally translated and what the difference is?
Sure. This is fun because I haven't thought about some of these texts in a long time. I wrote this book a while ago, but this one I remember very well. I mean, what I try to argue is that Romans 4 is actually the culmination of an argument that's begun all the way back, frankly, at the end of Romans chapter 1. That's not that's not some controversial idea. Most people see, Romans 1, 2, 3, 4 as part of a coherent argument. And what I suggest is that what Paul is up to in those 4 chapters is trying to demonstrate that whatever historic difference there was between Jews and Gentiles, now that Christ has died and been resurrected, those historic distinctions are no longer relevant, because the way a person is determined to be a Jew, circumcised, and a member of Israel, and every other accolade or title that goes along with being Jewish are now accomplished through baptism into Christ. And I argue, based on the work of a Scandinavian scholar whose name I'm probably going to mispronounce, I think his name is Runar Torstensen, that the person with whom Paul is arguing in these chapters is not a Jew. For a long time, the interlocutor with Paul in these chapters was thought to be a Jew, because Paul at one point says, if you call yourself a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And what Runar Torstensen argued, and several others have followed, including me, is to say that no, this guy calls himself a Jew, but is in fact not a Jew. It's a Gentile who thinks that he is becoming a Jew by becoming circumcised and becoming a proselyte to Judaism. But in fact, what Paul is trying to demonstrate is that, in fact, the way you become a Jew is by being baptized into Christ. And so what happens then in Romans 2, 3, 4 is that this interlocutor keeps kind of pushing Paul. Wait. Are you saying that baptism into Christ makes us a Jew, makes us circumcised? And then in chapter 4, he gets to saying, wait. Are you saying that even the title descendant of Abraham according to the flesh is a title that we Gentiles can take if we are baptized? And at the end of this argument, Paul says, yeah, even that. Now, the reason why I think Paul is saying this has to do with grammar. So in Romans 4:1, Paul has this this tiun erumen statement, what shall we say? And many people have taken Abraham to be the subject of this sentence. And what shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, found?
Mm-hmm.
And I read an article by Richard Hayes, the illustrious scholar at Duke, whose son, by the way, lives in Pasadena and teaches at Fuller and is a friend of mine. But I read this wonderful article where Richard Hayes suggests that this is actually not the best reading of Romans 4:1. That, in fact, a better grammatical rendering of it, based on other things in Paul's corpus, is not Abraham as the subject, but as the object. So that the interlocutor says, okay, what are we going to say? That we've found Abraham to be our forefather according to the flesh? And I think he's right. And I mean, you could read the book and see what grammatical arguments Hayes used and I borrowed. But the one place where I think Richard Hayes missed it is that, and where I think I innovated, is suggesting that the answer to this question is not no.
Mm-hmm.
It's yes. That Paul says, what then shall we say? And Paul says this a number of times in his letters. And when the answer is no, when he's introducing a question for which the answer is no, he almost always, if not always, I'll have to go look at the evidence, he either always or almost always responds with some kind of negation, upantos, me genoito,
Right.
I don't know, some kind of no.
Right.
But when he doesn't say no, it happens a couple of times, the answer is holy moly, yes. And so here, because he doesn't negate it, I think he's saying, what shall we say? The absurd conclusion that we Gentiles baptized into Christ have found that Abraham is our father, even according to the flesh? Silence, meaning, yeah. And now I'm going to show you how. And the argument culminates then in 4, 11, and 12, where Paul seems to suggest that because Abraham demonstrated his faith in, Genesis 15 and Parashat Lech Lecha, and then was circumcised in Genesis chapter 17, right? The circumcision therefore serves as a fleshly seal of the faith. And so in in verse 12, it says that Abraham became a father of circumcision, not only to those who will become circumcised, which is to say Jews, but also to those who follow in the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised, namely those Gentiles who are baptized into Christ, but not physically circumcised. And the reason I'm able to make that argument is because in verse 12, there's actually 2 definite article choices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, normally that's been read to say, oh, Abraham has become the ancestor of the circumcision to those Jews who also have Abrahamic faith. But grammatically, it's permissible, but it's not necessarily the best reading of what Paul's saying. The doubling of the tois, and some commentators even admit, oh man, I wish Paul didn't double this tois. I think it was Cranfield who said, yeah, this must have been a slip of the pen. But maybe it's not a slip of the pen. Maybe the reason Paul doubled the tois is to imply, or not to imply, to say that there are actually 2 different groups that can have Abraham as a father of circumcision. Group 1, tois, being Jews who were physically circumcised. Group 2 being Gentiles who were baptized into the faith that Abraham had, but were not actually circumcised. Now, I should point out, I think this is nonsense. I think Paul makes a crappy argument here. But I think that's what Paul's argument is. And I said earlier that I kind of have the luxury as a Jewish scholar to say that, yeah, I think Paul takes positions that will largely feed into supersessionism and become, frankly, objectionable for a lot of Christians today. But I should say that as a Jewish scholar, I also have the luxury of saying, I think Paul's wrong. But I'm not, I hope everybody appreciates that when I'm saying this is what Paul is saying,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Paul was right. I don't think Paul is authoritative. I think Paul was wrong. But I think Paul was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul was really clever. And Paul was a very savvy interpreter of text and history.
Mm-hmm.
Although in this case, I think he makes a pretty weak argument. But just because it's weak doesn't mean that it's not the argument that he's making based on grammar and context. Based on grammar and context. Yeah.
When he says Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, is he meaning biological descendancy, or does this have to do with the state of circumcision?
In this particular passage, I think what he's saying is this question is being asked by a Gentile who is figuring out, should I be circumcised because I've been baptized or shouldn't I? And this Gentile is saying, Are you saying, Paul, that if I become baptized, I can claim Abraham as a forefather according to the flesh? Surely that claim is only available to Jews who are both descended from Abraham according to the flesh and share the fleshly seal of circumcision that Abraham had. So I think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
And what Paul is saying here is that if you have the faith that Abraham had, you are essentially a sharer in the circumcision that Abraham had, and therefore you are his descendant according to the flesh. The argument that they are also descendants in terms of pedigree
Mm-hmm.
doesn't come up in Romans, I think, in any significant way, but it's featured prominently, as you probably know, in Galatians chapter 3. Again, where Paul makes an argument that I think is borderline fatuous, but nonetheless, it's the argument Paul makes because Paul wants, in Galatians, his recipients to believe that even though their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is not Abraham, in fact, their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is Abraham.
Right. So Paul clearly knows that being a descendant, there's a biological element to that, yet he's considering them. Like, does he think that, like, how is he seeing them as being descendants spiritually, or is he just considering them descendants, even though he knows biologically they're not? I think you used the term in your book that they're reckoned as being descendants. Is that right?
Yeah. I probably use that word, or putative, all kinds of words like that. And I actually use, I think, a helpful passage from the Talmud, which I don't think you have on a slide. But there's a great passage in the Talmud where the rabbis are wrestling with a problem. And the reason it's a great passage for understanding Paul is that it's related to the issue of circumcision. And the rabbis are trying to figure out, what do we do with the problem that there are hemophiliac boys who can't be circumcised? Because in order to be in the covenant with Abraham, you have to be circumcised. But when you have parents that have a son and he dies from circumcision, and then a second son that dies from circumcision, eventually, to be kind, we have to say, the third son, you can't circumcise him, you'll kill him.
Mm.
But does that mean he's not in the covenant? And what the Talmud says, it doesn't say this exactly, but the upshot is what the Talmud says is, he's considered as though he's circumcised, even though he's not circumcised. So to the extent that you have to have a circumcised penis to be in the covenant with Abraham, this hemophiliac boy who has a foreskin, he's actually circumcised. Not in some weird spiritual way, not a Jeremiah circumcision of the heart. For what matters, he's circumcised, even though he's not. And by the way, that passage also goes into the issue of, well, what about non-Jews who are circumcised? Are they in the covenant?
Mm-hmm.
And the Talmud says, no, because even though they're circumcised, they're actually not. And then it also goes into the issue of women. And it comes up with the conclusion that even though women don't even have penises, they're considered circumcised insofar as they are participants in the Abrahamic covenant. It's a wonderful passage. And so what I think Paul is saying is that even though a Gentile baptized into Christ clearly doesn't have Abraham as a real great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, but insofar as it matters, he does. And a Gentile baptized into Christ doesn't have a circumcised penis back then. But insofar as it matters, he does. And that's hard to understand, but we actually, but it's not that unusual that we reckon this kind of identity when that identity matters, but it's impossible to attain.
Great. So this brings me right into my next question. In your book, you argue that this is different from being a spiritual descendant or being spiritually circumcised, as some of the new perspective on Paul guys might say, like N.T. Wright and others, that
Mhm.
this is a eschatological circumcision. This is the true circumcision, a spiritual circumcision of your heart and your sinful nature. You're saying no, it's different than that. They're reckoned as being physically circumcised. Although and when I'm reading, what pops up in my mind, and I think this probably pops up in a lot of people's minds, is, well, is there really a difference? Is this just a pedantic thing? And you acknowledge that, and you say, quote, both acknowledge a change in identity that is wholly intangible or non-empirical in nature. Both are mediated by faith, but the difference is significant. Why do you think the difference is important?
Sure. A couple of reasons. The second is more important, but I'll start with the first. The first is that too often when people say, oh, Paul believes in literal circumcision of the penis and then a spiritual circumcision of the heart, or literal descent from Abraham and spiritual descent from Abraham, a literal Israel and a spiritual Israel. That to me ties into the notion that there are actually two peoples of God, right? There's one that's the physical, older, circumcised, historic Israel. And there's the new spiritual, Christian-based Israel. And that's the kind of distinction between two different Israels that will eventually find its maturation in the Epistle to Barnabas and then Justin Martyr, and it will become the foundation of Christianity and Christian supersessionism. But I don't think that that's something that Paul holds to. I don't think Paul thinks there are two different Israels. What Paul says is that there's one Israel, and that Israel is the Israel that is determined by baptism into Christ. That's one reason. The second reason is that there is a tendency, because of the development of Christianity, to see Christianity as a spiritualization of Judaism, a universalization of Judaism. And therefore, Paul is seen to be the progenitor of that. But I think it's important, and this is maybe where I'm actually more in line with the radical new perspective on Paul than just the new perspective on Paul. I don't know. But it's critically important to see that Paul is not a universalizer in that respect. Paul is not a spiritualizer in that respect. Paul is very much thinking in ethnic Jewish terms, that a Jew has a circumcision of the penis. A Jew is a physical descendant from Abraham. And so he says, look, these people baptized into Christ, they have to be considered Jews. They have to be considered Israel. Well, how can we say that? We have to come up with some way of saying that they are actually circumcised and actually descendants of Abraham, physically speaking. Now, it's impossible. And because it's impossible, and because this identity is only reckoned, it makes sense that after a generation or two, people are like, come on, I'm not really circumcised. I'm not really a descendant from Abraham, maybe in some spiritual sense. And that's why it develops. But Paul is thinking in old-fashioned ethnic Jewish terms. And by acknowledging the difference between reckoned circumcision and spiritual circumcision, we preserve that ethnic Jewishness of Paul, and we don't turn him into a spiritualizer that a 2nd or 3rd century Christian might be like. The third reason this is important, I said there were two, but the third reason is because if we read a spiritualized circumcision as opposed to a reckoned Christianity, or excuse me, a reckoned circumcision, it doesn't explain the text. So in Romans 2, for example, when Paul is talking about how if you have a circumcised penis and you don't act or believe the right way, he says it's as though you have a foreskin. He doesn't say it's as though you have an uncircumcised heart. And likewise, he says in Romans 2, this is towards the end, the late high 20s, 25, 28, something like that. He says, if you have a foreskin, But I don't know what he says. If you follow the righteous statutes of the law, whatever it is, your foreskin is reckoned a circumcised penis. He doesn't say your heart is reckoned. So Paul is talking about genitals. For Paul, that circumcised penis remains important. It's not a spiritualized circumcision of the heart. So it also explains Paul's texts, in my opinion, better than a spiritualized conception of circumcision or descent.